welcome back to our series on the story of Aurora Mardiganian. In our first episode, we got introduced to Archelaus, an incredible woman who endured 2 years of unspeakable violence and trauma under Ottoman occupation. My name is Maxim Saakyan, and you're listening to Uncovering Roots. We pick up Archelaus' story as she leaves Tiflis, now known as Tbilisi, in 1917, where she met with Armenian commander Andranik Ozanian. He gave her orders to travel to America and tell the world about the Armenian genocide. But her journey to America wasn't straightforward. She arrived in St. Petersburg just as the Russian Revolution kicked off. She feared for her life again. She managed to keep a low profile and eventually made it to Oslo with the help of a humanitarian organisation. From Oslo, she took a boat which was transporting refugees and finally arrived at Ellis Island in America. Archelaus was just 16 years old. She was taken in by an Armenian couple when she arrived. They helped her post news advertisements in search of her brother Vahan, whom she believed to be living in the States. She had interviews with the New York Sun and the New York Tribune, which were published alongside these advertisements. Her story piqued the interest of writer Henry Layford Gates. Henry and his wife Eleanor soon became her legal guardians. After becoming her legal guardians, they changed her name to a more anglicised version, Aurora Mardiganian. An important piece of this story to me was the change of her name. I wasn't sure which name to use when creating this podcast. After speaking to people who met Aurora, she seemed to find great pride with both names, Aurora and Archelaus. With that being said, we'll now be using Aurora for the rest of the podcast. One of the leaders of the humanitarian organisation that helped her get to the US met with Aurora. They offered her a place in a boarding school, but even as a young teenager, she put the Armenians ahead of herself. She told them how she would have loved to study music at school, but she now had a different purpose in life: to deliver the message from her suffering nation to the people of the United States. Henry Gates set up headquarters at New York's Latham Hotel for Aurora, just months after she escaped the Ottomans. Aurora didn't speak much English, and Gates didn't know any Armenian. Through short oral installments, Aurora recounted her story in Armenian, which was translated into English, transcribed, and then edited by Henry Gates. During one of the days when Aurora was recounting her story, she was asked what hurt more: her witnessing the murder of her family, or seeing the slaughter of the Armenian nation.
Which one do you think that hurt you more? Well, I said, that's a hard question. The people of my nation, I said, in Armenian I talk, and then the man is translating, see? So then I said, my people is my nation. My nation is go, then no more Armenia live. And my people hurt just as much as my parents. My parents hurt me just as much as my people.
After recounting her tragic story through Henry Gates and the translator, the book Ravished Armenia was complete and published in 1918. Although finding an original copy of the book is challenging, it had wide distribution in both America and Britain. Anthony Slide, an expert on the book, thinks that over 1 million copies were sold in America alone, while in Britain, the 13th edition of the book sold over 350,000 copies. In fact, the book was translated into many different languages across the world. It was very popular in South America, specifically Argentina, where there is a large Armenian diaspora living in the country. Other countries include Cuba, Mexico, and even Japan. Right after the completion of the book, Aurora was sent to a convent for 3 weeks to try and learn English. On her return, she was asked to sign some papers. Eleanor Gates told her that these would permit her to come to LA, where she would have her picture taken. On Aurora's assumption that Eleanor was referring to a still picture, she signed. The deal was set, where she was to earn $15 a week to star in the film version of the book.
The film, in our terms, was turned around extremely quickly.
This is Carla Garapedian, a former BBC World News anchor, documentarian, producer, director, and activist with a lifelong involvement in the Armenian community, and learnt about Aurora when she was a teenager.
It was actually filmed and, completely filmed within 6 weeks. The editing was very short, so less than 2 months you have filming and an edited film. It was partly interrupted because of the Spanish flu pandemic. Fascinating to read about the regulations imposed on the film industry and on actors in that period. So we're talking about December 1918, the month of December when they really were filming. One of the iconic images of Auction of Souls or Ravished Armenia is the image of the women on the crucified on the crosses.
Auction of Souls, or Ravished Armenia, was the name of the film.
For those who don't know, that did not happen in the Armenian genocide. Women, as Aurora says in one of her interviews, that Armenian women were crucified, impaled in a very different way, where they were made to sit on knives and swords. This is one of the most harrowing excerpts of her account. But the women on the cross, that iconic image, one of the models allegedly, and this has been confirmed in later research, died after acquiring the Spanish flu, after being up there on these huge, of course, they're movie props, but that said, while they were filming, she got very sick. And some people said she died of exposure, but it was later revealed she died of the Spanish flu.
The film was shot less than a month late in 1918.
This is Anthony Slide, a film historian who republished the original book, Ravished Armenia, after meeting Aurora in the 1980s.
They built an Armenian town as a set at what was called the Selig Zoo. Colonel Selig not only had a film studio, he also had a zoo, because he had a lot of animals that he used in his movies, so he was able to exploit the animals as well as his movies. Mount Baldy, just outside Los Angeles, stands in for Mount Ararat, and the desert scenes were supposedly shot on the beach at Santa Monica, although I don't think this is true, because if you look at the beach at Santa Monica, no way does it resemble the desert. I think the other interesting change, of course, is that Aurora has to have a love interest who appears at the beginning and the end of the film, and he is named Andranich. So here they've managed to get us confused by presenting an Armenian national hero who looks nothing like an Armenian national hero, but adds a love interest to the story.
It was an intense 6 weeks for Aurora, during which she not only contracted the Spanish flu, but also broke her foot during the filming. In the movie, there is a scene where she is shown escaping by jumping from the roof of a building. However, instead of landing on the next roof, she fell 20 feet and broke her foot. Despite her injury, filming continued, and you can actually see the bandage around her foot in some of the scenes from the film.
And I had pericrutches. They put me in bed and I wasn't able to walk. After 3 months after, I had to travel with the film. But in California, 3 weeks after, I had to start making the film. And they took off the cast, and then they bandaged it around and all. And even when you see the film, you'll see all the bandages tied up on my foot. Well, that's the way I was marching on the desert. That came just come handy, like real, you know.
The film finished and was turned over very quickly. The first screening was in January 1919. A few days later, a public screening of Ravished Armenia was given at the Majestic Theatre in LA. The first New York performance took place a month later, in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. Now we say Ravished Armenia for the film currently, but the name Auction of Souls was used more prominently for the film after the initial screenings. Carla touched on this when we talked about the sensitivities of the word ravished.
From what I can make out, Ravished Armenia, I think there were objections to the word ravished, which shows you the prudery of the time. And I think the negative reaction to the nudity in the film, now we wouldn't see it as nudity now, but the scantily clad women, the showing of the ankles, in those times, actresses or actors were considered almost like prostitutes if you showed that amount of flesh. So the idea of ravished, I think, was the objection, but it was definitely Auction of Souls when it showed here in the United Kingdom. It was Auction of Souls in Cuba and Puerto Rico where it was distributed. So it maintained that name after its initial premiere in the United States as Ravished Armenia.
The film encountered censorship problems, especially in the United Kingdom. It was first screened privately in London at the Queen's Hall later that year. Following that initial screening, the League of Nations Union, which was only just created, arranged for the film to be presented twice daily for 3 weeks at London's famous Royal Albert Hall, beginning in January 1920. This shows just how popular the film was expected to be, even outside the United States. However, the Foreign Office became worried that this might affect their peace talks with Turkey. Following this, 9 days before the screening was supposed to start, officers from Scotland Yard viewed the film and threatened prosecution if Auction of Souls was to be publicly screened. In the end, after some protests from the League of Nations Union, the presentation was approved, subject to the removal of all references to Christians in the subtitles and the cutting of the famous crucifixion scene. It's important to note that to this day, the British government does not recognise the Armenian genocide.
But it did get a wide release in the United Kingdom. And it didn't just show in 1 year. Between the beginning, I think, of the first screening, 1919, when it premiered here, and then it was still out there in 1923. Anthony Slide helped us, the Armenian Film Foundation, track down every commercial screening of the film in the UK and in Northern Ireland. And I was just amazed at the reach of it and how it kept going. It was a popular film. Popular not for the political reasons, but because it was sensational. It had this feeling of being real war, like actuality, as I was saying earlier. It had this excitement to it, and maybe not in a good way, because it was sensationalized in the way that The Sheikh was with Rudolph Valentino. It was in that kind of ilk. So people were flocking to see it because of that. And there was a lot of publicity they did. She contributed to the publicity. But I think that made a difference because it did get an amazing amount of press. And in the United States, it was serialized. Her book then became popular again. It was serialized going into the future by a couple of years at least, so you could still see the book serialized in the early 20s, and the movie helped that. So in many ways, Aurora and her story, partly because of the sensationalized nature of it, but I think also because of her involvement, it did get attention on the issue.
Despite the censorship problems, the film broke box office records, a fact that not many people are really aware of. When the film opened in the Washington Theatre in Detroit in 1919, it broke all box office records in the city. This is despite the city's slight censorship of only letting those over the age of 21. Box office records were similarly broken in Dayton, Ohio in early January. In fact, as one newspaper said, the film shattered all previous box office records, that there had to be another showing in the future. You can even see pictures of the endless queue in front of the theatre. People were desperate to see this film. Aurora made personal appearances at each screening. There were even morning performances for ladies only, where Aurora went into more detail about the experiences of the women during the genocide. We don't have the exact numbers, but Anthony Slide thinks that around 10 million Americans saw the production. The film didn't just travel across the States. The film was screened across the world, including Australia, the Netherlands, Argentina, and many others. While Aurora was travelling the country with the film, she met with many famous celebrities. At the peak of her fame, she was really admired by diplomats, politicians, and other famous movie stars. One celebrity she really remembers was famous British silent movie star Charlie Chaplin. President Woodrow Wilson was also a fan of Aurora, and his son even nearly proposed to Aurora. But despite the fame, she was completely alone. She was without her family and friends, and her life became promoting the film. The constant public appearances for Aurora became too much for just one individual to handle. There was even talk of sending Aurora, who was clearly traumatized and still a teenager, to London to appear at the British screenings in 1920. She made her last personal appearance with the film in Buffalo, New York in May 1920, where she fainted. Henry Gates was furious that Aurora had fainted, telling her how she ruined his and her mission. Aurora's guardian sent her to a convent and hired 7 Aurora lookalikes to appear with the film in the future. The world assumed she was still travelling around with the film. Aurora was trapped and had to escape yet again. She climbed over the walls of the convent and went to New York.
The idea of a young girl experiencing this kind of thing, that she also came over as being very sincere. In her interviews later, she talks about how she met very important people. She actually had an audience with President Coolidge, and then
it was actually President Woodrow Wilson.
His son, she said his son proposed to her. It was something crazy like that. But maybe it wasn't so crazy when you think that, she was a star. And the movie was considered not just by the community, the Armenian community, but by the Hollywood community, the money community. It was an earner. And box office is everything in Hollywood. And the film really did well. I think Aurora, in the midst of that, I try to imagine this young girl who probably never left her hometown, her village town, and in a matter of years witnesses the complete destruction of her community, the death of her parents, and then she's thrust into a new world, and she then becomes a movie star. I mean, you think that is not normal, but she somehow holds it together, and maybe the part of her that needed to withdraw was the part of her, and I may be projecting here, but maybe it's the part of her that knew, okay, enough. It's now my time to get away from the craziness. And the man that she ended up marrying, I'm not sure to what extent she was actually looking to get married, but I think it basically took her out of that world and got her into a quieter life.
When listening to Aurora speak and hearing the stories from people who met Aurora, it was clear that the biggest motivation for Aurora to tell her story was to raise money to help her people. That was what Aurora was. She was caring, even if it made her life more difficult. The amount of money Aurora and the film raised is breathtaking. Between 1917 and 1930, the humanitarian organization that helped her get to the US, Near East Relief, raised $117 million, with a significant contribution from Aurora and the film. Adjusted for inflation, this would be worth over $2 billion. Near East Relief, which was an American charity, organized one of the biggest large-scale humanitarian projects in response to the genocide. They delivered food and clothing, as well as setting up refugee camps, clinics, hospitals, and orphanages, from Athens in Greece to Aleppo in Syria. Near East Relief is credited with saving over 1 million lives between 1915 and 1930, including 132,000 orphan children.
So there were other actors who were enlisted in the cause of Near East relief. Some folks may remember Jackie Coogan, the child actor, who did a lot to promote it.
For those who don't know who Jackie Coogan was, he was one of the first child stars in Hollywood, most notably working closely with Charlie Chaplin.
There was a milk campaign, buy a carton of milk. There was Remember the Starving Armenians. There was a kind of PR campaign. And the movie was definitely part of the effort and was important in raising awareness. Near East relief was an American idea. It wasn't an Armenian. That this is what's important to emphasize. Americans who wanted to do something in the absence of a political solution, because the United States government was not going to intervene to stop Turkey from doing what it was doing, but it could make a difference in terms of humanitarian relief. It wasn't the first time that America had done some kind of humanitarian intervention. The International Red Cross in the late 19th century, with Clara Barton as the kind of driving force, that was one of the first international interventions of the Red Cross to help Armenians. But this Near East relief campaign was driven by American politicians. So you could say it was quasi-governmental. And I think also Henry Morgenthau, the ambassador, had some influence on this. So Near East relief probably was one of the most successful American humanitarian relief campaigns up to that point of time. If you look at the scale of the money and the amount to which it actually went to the people who needed it, you could say it was a very successful campaign.
Although it's remarkable how far her story has travelled, it's important to acknowledge that her involvement in the book and film came at a cost of exploitation. When we just look at the wage she got for participating in the film, she only earned $15 a week to be the lead actress of the film that was based on her life, a very low amount even for that time. In the 1920s, lead female actresses tended to get paid between $70 to $400 a week. She was earning practically nothing when travelling with her film, doing performance after performance where she was forced to revisit her traumas. Aurora was due to be paid $7,000 for her personal appearances with the film. However, Eleanor Gates reported that payment for her personal services, together with the cost of hiring 7 Aurora impersonators, a chauffeur and a nurse, totaled $6,805. So how much was Aurora due? $195. This led to outrage, and Aurora decided to take Henry and Eleanor Gates to court. Newspapers in the US were horrified by this story, with an issue of the Evening World titling the story, "Armenian Refugee Got $15 a Week as Star of Film Play," where they also reported that Miss Gates only gave Aurora $195. Henry Gates testified that her life story was bought from her for $50. Soon after this, it was sold for $700 to a publisher called the International Copyright Bureau. The printed books were then sold for 50 cents a copy when Aurora gave a talk, where she would just get 5 cents of this. Eventually, Aurora won $5,000 from the court case.
It's true. When you think about it, it does seem to be exploitative. My guess is that it wasn't unusual and that she wasn't singled out, that women in general who didn't have a lot of power, and she was essentially powerless. They probably thought they had created her, and so were able to set the terms. And that's, of course, why we have agents now. Aurora didn't have an agent or a person to represent her for her own sake. I think there were women in that set, in that circle, who did try to help her, but I think financially she was very much out on a limb. And it's really remarkable that she came through it intact.
Given the circumstances of how Aurora's story was brought to light, I think it really raises the question about whether Henry Gates had her best interests at heart. While he certainly played a role in raising awareness about the Armenian genocide, the fact that he became her legal guardian and had her recount her tragic story through a translator raises concerns about his motivations and intentions. And looking back, Henry Gates seemed to have a history of exploiting women.
I think it depends on what you think best interests are. If the interest was to tell the world about the Armenian genocide, I think his interests were sincere. If his interest was to use Aurora to tell that story without perhaps adequately understanding, that she was suffering from acute post-traumatic stress, which is how we would call it now. Did he understand that? Did the people around him completely understand that? I would say, on the basis of what we know, no, they did not understand that. Was she exploited? I think you could say, looking at the facts, it looks like she probably was, insofar as anybody who had experienced that probably should not have been making a movie not long after they'd experienced it. I think the telling of the story in a book and the selling of the book was something that I think probably, at least in my minds, was ethically correct, because getting a survivor's story so close to when they experienced it is really important. And I think her memories would have been very acute. The book, I actually bought a copy of it in London on, just went online to Amazon. And to hold that book in your hands, to read it, it is a harrowing account. It's traumatic reading it. And there are parts of it that I wish I hadn't read, to be honest. So I can't imagine what it would have been like to go through that. And you have to imagine, too, this is a fairly short amount of time from her being, whisked away to America to her recounting the story. The Armenian genocide as we know it was still going on. So it was contemporaneously, it's fascinating to have this account popularized and told by a survivor while it's still happening. So for her, from a personal point of view, I think there was a certain form of exploitation, but with the ethics of the time, I'm not sure that the people who were perpetrating that actually knew and saw it as a form of exploitation, which doesn't excuse it. But the upside was that the book and the movie did reach a lot of people, for what that's worth.
Although some films have survived from that era, Auction of Souls is unfortunately not one of them. I was at a talk recently where a producer familiar with her story explained that they opened up boxes where there's a big label titling the box Auction of Souls. Once opened, the material is there apart from the rolls containing the footage. There's a strong belief that Turkey underwent a campaign to try and destroy the film. Though this could be a possibility, we need to also remember that this was a silent film. A recent study of the Library of Congress revealed that of the almost 11,000 silent films produced between 1912 and 1929 in the United States, only 30% remain, including incomplete ones. However, there is still some hope in finding the film.
So Auction of Souls is considered technically what's called a lost film, which means there is no surviving print of the film or master of the film that anybody can put their hands on. All these years later, is it possible that there is still a print circulating or a dupe of the nitrate? Nitrate, of course, for people who follow the silent movie problem, as we call it, that most originals are missing because nitrate is so inflammable and has caused so many fires. There was a recent huge find in Dawson City in Canada, where a lot of Hollywood silent films were found. They were frozen in a swimming pool and had survived all of these years, discovered by some miracle by two very enterprising researchers. And of course I was following this, Aurora Auction of Souls was not one of the prints in there. But the question of, is it possible that a nitrate print could have survived? The answer is yes, it is possible, because there were many prints, because it was a popular film. We do know that prints were usually destroyed after their run because they'd be scratched, they'd be beaten up, and there'd be no reason to store them. But this was a sensational film, a controversial film, a film that was very popular. So we can't assume that the theater owners would destroy the prints. We also can't assume that a dupe wasn't made, a duplicate in another format.
And in fact, Carla was one day looking into the files of J. Michael Hagopian, the founder of the Armenian Film Foundation, and discovered something astonishing.
So his search, when I went through his files, I was curious about the film. His files went back to something like 1969 when he started to really search it out. And he actually found somebody in London who had located a print. And as the story went, he did a little more research. And allegedly, according to Michael's notes and further interviews he did with family members, a print was found in Turkey. And it was retrieved and brought back to London. And you may ask, what happened to that print? The person who retrieved it allegedly destroyed the print. And that person was an Armenian. This was according to his son. And it brings up the whole specter of what the Armenian community thought about the film when it came out and after. We now think of it as the first Hollywood movie made about the Armenian genocide. And oh, wouldn't it be fantastic if we found a print? But way back then, Aurora and the way she was shown in that movie, Armenians were more prudish. And it was a very sensationalized account and depiction of the Armenian genocide. And there was a certain amount of shame.
I still remember the shock and pain I felt when Carla told me this. How close we were to potentially finding and preserving this film, but we're still searching. But it's also important to understand why people wanted to destroy it. We don't want the genocide to define us. We're so much more than that. And not only this, but the film did exploit Aurora. There's no question about that. And there are many people against this. There was a protest in 1919 in New York calling to stop the movie and the exploitation of the girl. Now, nitrate film is no joke. There has been several instances of major fires breaking out due to the flammable nitrate films. One of the famous instances was in 1937 in the United States, where a fire broke out in a 20th Century Fox facility, which caused 1 death and 2 injuries. Carla Garipedian recalled the time she really realized how dangerous nitrate was.
So for those who were searching, here's the upside. We're now in 2022, and more film archives are posting their inventory, which makes it a lot easier to search. So we have that going for us. We have going for us the fact that there are, eBay and places, recycling firms who will often report to interested enthusiasts, hey, somebody just dumped some film cans my way. And I've had that happen. I've gone on eBay, and there's a person who doesn't know anything about film, but has had a couple of film cans dumped with nitrate. And in the colder countries, that's means that, it's possible the nitrate could survive. But then that poses the most damning part, or the most negative part of the film searching quest, which is you could find something, but it's decayed. So that is the curse of working with nitrate. And it means that even if we find a print, if it hasn't been kept in cold environment or a dry environment, or if it's too dry, that can be a problem. There could be all manner of issues. We don't know that we would find an intact print. But we're Armenian and we're used to persisting, right?
And Carla is absolutely right. As Armenians, we never give up. With this episode wrapping up, here's one last message from Carla.
So the Armenian Film Foundation, we're always interested in any leads on Ravished Armenia or Auction of Souls. If you know anything about an archive or any private collector, anyone who has a collection of films from that period, they may not even know that they have Auction of Souls. But if you have any leads, please contact us at the Armenian Film Foundation, because the search continues and we are not going to give up.
Auction of Souls is considered a lost film. There's been numerous attempts to find the film, but the hope of finding it was fading away. Until 1994.
And at one point, I simply could not believe what I was seeing.
No, I mean, there's a lot of misinformation out there about what survives of the film.
When we met her, she was like, oh my God, how did we not know her of?
This episode was produced and sound designed by me, Maxim Saakyan. Editorial support from Shaibani and sound design support from George Patterson. If you can leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts, that will help us a lot. Thank you so much for listening to Uncovering Roots, and we'll see you in the next episode.